first modern queer identities were coined. Queer people have always existed. It's not an invention of a decadent modern times. Vibrant, queer and sexually liberated life in Berlin.
Hi and welcome to Sex in Berlin. I am Nika. I'm a culture journalist and pleasure enthusiast, and your host for today's episode, brought to our collaboration with The Berliner, your guide to Berlin's culture, politics and sex-positive scene. And the whole thing is now available as a book, Sex in Berlin, Guide to Love, with lots of pictures, helpful tips and exciting text. Today I have the pleasure of welcoming Jeff Magnus to our studio. He's a social scientist, a sex educator, freelance author and a tour guide. And I was so happy last Friday I could attend a tour of him, and I can say it was really magical. He offers some rather unconventional city tours under the name Berlin Guide. I took part in his tour Berlin Uncensored, a history of sex and freedom. Dear Jeff, I'm delighted to have you in this little pink studio with us today, so welcome.
Thank you for having me.
How did it come that you're professionally involved with sexuality and social freedom, and then you created tours? So how did it happen?
Well, I started very early to be interested in human sexualities and sexual science. With 16, I had my coming out as a gay man, and then immediately I started to be very interested. I wanted to understand, why do humans have the sexuality that they do? So I already came across the name Magnus Hirschfeld very, very early, when I was about 17 or so. Magnus Hirschfeld is a person also that's very important on my tours, the founder of modern sexual science in Berlin. And my eagerness to understand sexuality also grew a lot over the following years. And then eventually I moved to Berlin. I got a job offer in Berlin, and then I fell in love with the city, because it's often referred to as the world's most sexual city sometimes by a lot of people that come here and love to Berlin exactly for that reason. And that's also exactly why I love Berlin. I was able to see so many different sexualities, gender and sexual identities, also kinks and fetishes in Berlin's club scene, for example, that it really fueled my fascination with sexuality and also my writing around sexuality. I mean, I've been living already for a few years in Berlin at that point, and I was already, when friends were visiting me in Berlin, I was already bringing them around the city a lot. And I thought, well, why not actually do this into a business, into a tour business of actually telling people about the history of sexuality in Berlin and also about the sex life in Berlin today.
When you started to be interested in sexuality, where did you grow up, and what kind of free sexuality was around your home place?
So I grew up in Luxembourg, a very small country in between Germany, France and Belgium. And
I've heard of.
Yeah, yeah. I always say it because I'm always I have my tour. I have, of course, a lot of people who are not from Europe, and they might not know Luxembourg so well. And Luxembourg is a very small country, so everybody knows everybody. Of course, that's already something that's not so, let's say, not so good for a very visible, open, diverse sex life as we have it here in Berlin, where people can be a little bit more anonymous in the city. And also, I mean, we do have sex ed in Luxembourg, and it's probably also better now than what it was when I was young. But when I was young, for example, and I had sex ed in school, we were basically just learning the basics around how to prevent HIV and how to prevent pregnancy. Remember one thing that we learned in school that today, of course, is complete rubbish when I look back at it. But we were, for example, learning also back then in school that men are naturally polygamous and women are naturally monogamous, because men want to spread basically their semen and women want to have somebody who provides. And that was, of course, later when I started also to go study sexuality, I also realized it was, of course, complete rubbish. But it gives a picture of what sexuality was actually like in Luxembourg, or learning about sexuality was also like in Luxembourg back then. It just didn't exist a lot, but I wanted to understand. I wanted to learn, of course, a lot at that time. I was very, very eager to learn sexuality. And that's also why, I guess, one of the reasons also why I eventually studied sociology, because I mean, sexual science is difficult to find still today. Even Berlin doesn't have a master in sexual science, and I wanted to go more into the sociological, psychological perspective of it. I didn't want to explain so much about what's happening chemically or biologically. I wanted to understand, why do people have the sexuality that they have? What role does our socialization play, for example, in it? And yeah, and that grew then over the years into what I'm doing now. Yeah.
So what are the main learnings you had over the years?
So one of the main learnings that I'm also giving on my tours, for example, is that there was a very, very big and early sexual liberation movement, including queer liberation movement, in Berlin, in Europe, especially in Berlin, around the beginning of the 20th century, so especially in the 1920s. We had the world's first queer emancipation liberation movement, long before Stonewall, for example. A lot of people think today that the queer liberation movement started with Stonewall, and there is some truth to that, in that the prides, as we know them today, started with Stonewall, but the groundwork for that was actually laid already in the mid of the 19th century, but then especially in the 1920s here in Berlin, when you had the world's first Institute of Sexual Science. At that institute was also the world's first organization for queer rights, was located at that institute. In Berlin and in Germany, the first modern queer identities were coined, as in like the world's, for example, in the mid of the 19th century, in Germany, you had Karl Heinrich Ulrichs, that was living, was a lawyer living in Germany, born in Germany, and he was often referred to by Volkmar Siegusch, a very famous sexual scientist in recent history, of being the world's first gay man. And that was because he was the first one to link homosexuality to an identity, before the word homosexuality even existed. Like, the word homosexuality was coined in 1869, and Karl Heinrich Ulrichs was mostly active in the 1850s, 1860s. So before him, it was seen as something that you do, not something that you are. It was an act, not an identity. So, for example, the song Born This Way by Lady Gaga would make no sense at all in those times, since people just didn't see it as something that you were born as. And he was the first one to change this, to say, no, this is not just something that I do, this is part of who I am, this is part of my identity. And by that he laid the cornerstone for the modern queer identity movement that we have today, because without this shift away from an act towards an identity, there would also not be the feeling of a shared identity in a community, and therefore also not a political movement that you can build out on of that community, that then also indeed then happened later, starting already a little bit by the end of the 19th century, but then especially in the 1920s in Berlin, when you had a vibrant queer and sexually liberated life in Berlin. Not only queer, but also in generally sexually liberated. You had a very strong feminist movement, a very strong women's liberation movement also in the 1920s, that of course also contributed to that sexual liberty. And you had the Sexual Science Institute, the world's first Institute of Sexual Science was founded in Berlin in 1919. And it was not just only an institute about science, but it was also an institute that wanted to connect the fight for sexual liberation with science. It was founded by Magnus Hirschfeld, a Jewish doctor, and he believed, like, his main motto was through science to justice. He really believed in connecting science with the fight for sexually marginalized communities.
There are still like these kind of scientists in Berlin today, so like, are there people doing good work for this kind of topic still? Or?
I mean, we do have that, although we do not have an institute of sexual science in that sense anymore. We do have, there are some classes, for example, at the Charité around sexuality. All those are more from a medical point of view. You do also have, for example, Professor Andreas Krass is somebody who's also studying a bit the history of sexuality at the University of Berlin. But you don't really have an institute of sexual science in that sense anymore, like you had in the 1920s. But of course, you do have a lot of movements for sexual liberation, for sexual exploration in Berlin, for sexual expression in Berlin also. Today, it's a bit more connected to the club culture, in parts to the club culture in Berlin, which sounds in the beginning maybe a little bit like it's all about just having fun and dancing, which in itself is not a problem, of course, also, but it's more than that, because club culture in Berlin today is very political. Club culture in Berlin today was built up by marginalized communities, including queer communities. So, of course, club culture in Berlin today is very, very political, and the sexuality that is so much connected with the club culture in Berlin today, and for which Berlin is also so famous for today, is also then by itself very, very political, yes.
Jeff, let's go back to Magnus Hirschfeld. So he had this very interesting institute. Can you tell us a little bit more about the work of Magnus Hirschfeld, and also what changed when the Nazis came?
So Magnus Hirschfeld was a Jewish doctor who moved to Berlin in 1896. And at that time he was already very much shaped by, first of all, the process against Oscar Wilde, who was punished for his homosexuality. That was the first thing that shaped him very, very much. And the other thing was, he was a doctor, as I said, and he was at the time also treating one of his patients for depression. And that patient committed suicide the day before his wedding, because he was gay, and his wedding was basically trying to fit into the social norms, but he realized that he just couldn't, and he committed suicide. And in his last letter he also wrote to Magnus Hirschfeld, I hope you can fight for the rights of people like me in the future, so that one day we can live more freely. And that really shaped him. Magnus Hirschfeld was of course also gay, but he then, in a year later, after he moved to Berlin in 1897, he then co-founded the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, the world's first organization for the rights of queer people. And the main goal of that organization at the time was to abolish paragraph 175, which was criminalizing male homosexuality in Germany back then. And they tried to do this via many different ways. For example, they asked their members to have leaflets lying around in train stations, in cafes, in bars, for example, that were then educating people about homosexuality. They were also, Hirschfeld was also, for example, co-producing the movie Different from the Others, which was the world's first gay movie. It was also educating about homosexuality. And Hirschfeld was, the main way that he tried to abolish the paragraph, however, was via petitions that they had many influential people sign. For example, there are names like Albert Einstein's name, for example, on that list. They also succeeded eventually to the Weimar Republic, the government at the time, to abolish the paragraph. However, then the Nazis, of course, also came into power, and the paragraph was never abolished. But of course there's also much more that happened before I come to the Nazi times. There's of course much more than just this organization that he founded. As I already said, he founded in 1919, he founded the world's first institute for sexual science. And that institute became really world-renowned globally. There were people from all over the world who came to Berlin to go to that institute, because it really made Berlin the center of sexual science in the world back then. The only center, of course, also because there was just this one institute in the world back then, but it really led to, like, for example, there were doctors could go to the institute to get free education about sexuality. There were international conferences happening at the institute. For example, also countries changed their laws around sexuality based on what was taught at those conferences. So it was generally a very, very influential institute. There were a lot of trans people who came to Berlin from all over the world to undergo gender affirmation surgery. This was the time where some of the world's first gender affirmation surgeries were performed here in Berlin in the 1920s. There was a sex museum at the institute where, for example, you had masturbation machines that were developed for women that were exhibited, for example, at that institute. So overall, it was really a very, very influential and globally very renowned place, that really made Magnus Hirschfeld very, very famous far over the borders of Berlin. And that, of course, also was then destroyed basically by the Nazis. The Nazis came then into power, or were given the power in 1933, and then everything was destroyed. The institute was one of the very first places that the Nazis attacked. First of all, Hirschfeld was Jewish. That played already a major role. The fact that he was gay also, but to a very different degree. There were, at least in the beginning, also quite quite a few gay Nazis. But even if they were gay Nazis, they still had a very strong idea about ideal masculinity. And Hirschfeld, what he did and how his research was definitely not how they perceived ideal masculinity. They started very early to do propaganda against Hirschfeld. And in 1933, when they then had the power, the institute was also one of the very first places that they attacked. Luckily, Hirschfeld was traveling the world back then, so he also never returned to save his life. But the Nazis then started to destroy the institute. They took all the books, all the papers, everything out of the institute and brought it then to the Bebelsplatz, or the place of the opera, as it was called back then. And they were then publicly burning his books. Most people know about the Nazi book burnings, but what many people don't know is that a lot of the books that were burned there came directly from the Institute of Sexual Science, and everything was destroyed. Hirschfeld was able to only save a little part of from the Nazis, from all his works that he did, and when all that was destroyed, of course, because there was just this one institute, there was nothing left. There was the whole, not only the sexual science movement was destroyed then, but also the world's first queer emancipation movement was completely eradicated then. And that's why a lot of queer people still today don't know their own history, because it was all destroyed by the Nazis.
Now there's a society, they try to collect the remaining things from Hirschfeld. What is the name?
Yeah, there's the Magnus Hirschfeld Gesellschaft, Magnus Hirschfeld Society, and they have an archive with those things that were then found again from the times around Hirschfeld. There's, of course, some of those things that were then found in the trash container in Canada, but I mean, even though I said that the Nazis destroyed everything, that's also not 100% true. They destroyed a lot, but they were also smart enough that they could sell a lot of the things, that could make money basically with a lot of the things that they took away from the institute.
Jeff, you said in the beginning that it's important for you to know history and to know queer history also. Please explain this a little bit more. So how important is it to know, like, also queer people, like in foreign times, or see yourself or us in a kind of linear way, and not only in a heterosexual world we were used to live for 2000 years, and we know that it's not true. So how important is it to know the history for a queer person?
I think for a very good example is the discussions that we have today around trans people and around non-binary people. A lot of people think today that this is all a new trend. Like now suddenly people are
changing their gender like they want.
Yeah, exactly,
I read an article and someone said, they want to change their gender every day. And to mix their names like they feel on a Monday or on a Tuesday. So is it a new thing?
I believe those beliefs are a direct result of the Nazis destroying the Institute of Sexual Science. We've been at this point of discussion already 100 years ago in Berlin, with different words. We didn't have the words non-binary at the time. We didn't have the word trans as we use it today at the time. We had different words. For example, we had the words transvestite. Transvestite was a term coined by Magnus Hirschfeld as an umbrella term for what we today would then call trans people, drag queens, drag kings, non-binary people, etc. Hirschfeld also coined the term sexuelle Zwischenstufe, sexual intermediary, which was also an umbrella term for anything that's outside the cisgender heterosexual norm. So there were already words there, and the debate that we had in Berlin in the 1920s sometimes reminds me a lot of the debate that we have today. And I believe that if the Nazis had not destroyed this history so that it was completely forgotten, we would talk very, very differently globally today around trans people, around non-binary people, and around queer people in general, because people would realize, this has actually been something that it's not a new trend. It's not now that suddenly people want to change their gender, quote unquote, all the time, but it is actually something trans people have existed already, always in human history. Non-binary people have existed already, always in human history. Queer people have always existed. It's not an invention of a, quote unquote, decadent modern times, but it has always been here in human history.
And how important is it for you personally to know that there were queer people like hundreds of years ago?
When I was in school and had history classes in a school in Luxembourg, we were, for example, also talking around the so-called Night of the Long Knives. The Night of the Long Knives was when Hitler decided to have his close friend Ernst Röhm killed. Ernst Röhm was a very, as I said, a close friend of Adolf Hitler. He was chief of the SA, or the Sturmabteilung, the Stormtroopers, a very, very important Nazi organization, a very, very big, brutal organization, and it was a really key organization in the Nazi rise to power. Very, very important. And he was pretty much openly gay, Ernst Röhm, and when his homosexuality was then one of the reasons that Hitler and the Nazis used to have him murdered. But back then, when we were learning about the Night of the Long Knives, his homosexuality was not mentioned at all, even though it was such an important, crucial moment in the history of Nazi Germany. And of course, people might now think, okay, but that's a gay Nazi. That's maybe not something somebody that you want to identify with. And of course, I don't want to identify with Ernst Röhm. But it was then very much connected to the persecution of gay people that then followed after that. Of course, the Nazis already were kind of persecuting gay people before, but then after the murder of Ernst Röhm, paragraph 175, the paragraph that was criminalizing male homosexuality in Germany, was then toughened by the Nazis, and the persecution of gay people then also really began. And it was a very, very important moment in the history of Nazi Germany that was completely not talked about in our history classes, for example.
When I was on your tour, I really enjoyed it. And I talked to other people who were also joining from the US. And one of the women, she told me that she works also for sexual science, and she's not allowed to talk about certain topics anymore because of the Trump government. For me, it's always easy to do finger pointing in the direction of the US and say, they have such a crazy president now. And then you said, in Germany they have 20% Nazis also today.
20% voted for the Nazi Party in the last elections, yes. Yeah.
And for me as a German, I felt pretty bad because it's so much easier to do finger pointing in different countries and don't see So I know that there are so many AfD voters in Germany. I know that, but it's also in my bubble easy to forget sometimes. I live in Kreuzberg, so many queer friends. For me, it not really changed something, but it is a big topic. So how do you link the Nazis 100 years ago to today's discussions also?
I forgot who said it, but somebody once said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And I like that saying a lot. We see it, for example, with the AfD today, that we just talked about Ernst Röhm in the Nazi Party in the 1920s, early 30s. Today we have Alice Weidel, another queer person who's leading the far-right party AfD today. So it's interesting how you sometimes have these parallels, because of course we all know what the AfD thinks of queer people, but again there's somebody who chooses to turn a blind eye to that in favor of seeking power. And we know how it ended for Ernst Röhm, and I think it will also probably not end good for Alice Weidel either. I'm not saying that she will be killed, but it will probably not the AfD will eventually not want to have a queer person leading their party, especially when they're doing so much anti-queer politics.
Jeff, when you do your tours, you're not only talking and telling wonderful stories and you make a nice walk, which is already very good. You showed us pictures on your iPad, and there we had some 3D pictures from today and foreign times. Can you explain us the technical thing a little?
So I use augmented reality with an app called Zaubach, or the company is called Zaubach. That's a startup in Berlin, and they approached me to basically do this project together. It's an augmented reality app, and it allows me to bring history to people in a completely new way. So, for example, we are standing in front of a building where in the 1920s you had the El Dorado Club. The El Dorado was, you can kind of call it the Berghain of the 1920s in terms of how famous it was. And we are standing then in front of this building, and then using my tablet, I can then point at the building, and on the screen people see them through the camera, the building in front of them, but with the front of the building layered over with how the building actually looked like in the 1920s. Another example is that, for example, we can walk through the street and we then see in the street as in real life size sex workers standing in the street, where we're then walking past them, sex workers from the 1920s, and I can then tell people about them. It's a little bit of a way of bringing history a little bit closer in a new way, and especially because the tour is also quite a long tour. It's a 3.5-hour tour, so instead of just me constantly talking, I try to include a lot of media elements into it: pictures, videos, augmented reality, quiz questions, audio, etc., so that it's a bit more interactive and a bit more interesting for all the senses, not just your ears, in that way. Yeah.
So you do the tour Berlin Uncensored, a history of sex and freedom, and also about queer history, and about the club culture.
Yeah.
So how is it linked?
I have 2 tours about club culture, one about the history of club culture and club culture in general today in Berlin, and another tour about more the kinky, sex-positive spaces and clubs in Berlin today. And they are all linked over the subjects from my previous tours, namely sexual history and queer history. Because, as already said, club culture today, or the sexuality in Berlin today, is very much linked to club culture, and club culture itself was also built up in marginalized communities, including the queer communities. So after the Second World War, Berlin and Germany were of course divided into East and West Berlin, and West Germany and the GDR, and that played an also a very big role, important role in the emergence of club culture and of the sexual Berlin that we know today. Because first of all, when the Nazis were over, it didn't go back to the liberty of the 1920s that we had before. Of course, there was, especially West Germany, continued a very, very patriarchal idea of what a woman is, of what a man is, of what family is supposed to be. So in the 50s and 60s, there was not really that much of a movement, neither a queer movement nor a sexual liberation movement so much in West Germany and West Berlin. And that all changed then, of course, with the sexual revolution by the end of the 60s, and also with the loosening of paragraph 175. The paragraph was then existed in the Nazi version in West Germany, and the GDR was a bit different, but in West Germany it existed in the Nazi version until 1969, so more than 2 decades after the end of the Second World War. It was then loosened in 69 and 71. That was the first reason for a queer movement to come up again. The second reason were the Stonewall riots in the United States in 1969, the reason why we have the prides today, and it also influenced the movement here in Europe. And the third most important reason was the movie Not the Homosexual is Perverted, but the Situation in Which She Lives, which was a movie that was released by Rosa von Braunheim in 1971, and calling upon queer people, especially gay men, to do something against their oppression. And right after the screening of that movie, the Homosexual Action West Berlin formed itself, which is today then seen as the beginning of the second queer liberation movement in Germany. So a lot of the things that we have today in Berlin come straight out of that movement. So, for example, the Schwutz Queer Club was in the beginning their center for political activism, but eventually turned into a club. It's today Germany's oldest and biggest queer club. We have, and then also that's the club culture that we know today, including also the sexuality in those clubs that we know today, started then also in the 1970s. In 1974, a trans woman, Romy Haag, opened her club, Chez Romy Haag, in the Schöneberg district in West Berlin, and that is today seen as the beginning of Berlin's modern club culture. Everything that we know today, from Kit Kat to Berghain, started basically in that building in 1974. A little bit later then, in the success of Romy Haag, not far away from there at Nollendorfplatz, the Metropol Club then opened. And Metropol was very much shaped by the gay and by the BDSM community, where you was known for people literally having sex on the dance floor. And it was the first club to play continuous beat all throughout the night. Like in other clubs, you had one song stopping, a second pause, another song starting, and here you had continuous beat playing all throughout the night, which is also why it's seen as a predecessor to techno that was then later coming from the black community in Detroit to Berlin in the beginning of the 90s. And that really continued over the 70s into the 80s. Of course, in the 80s, we have the AIDS crisis. That was, of course, a very big backlash again. But Berlin really, especially West Berlin, because it was this islands in the middle of the GDR, still continued developing the sexual life that we know today. And it was especially also developed by the queer community. And Bunker was a bunker built by the Nazis in the 1940s, but then after the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was then turned into one of those clubs in those abandoned buildings. And at Bunker, for example, the first snacks parties were organized. And the people who organized the snacks parties would later go on to open Berghain. Snacks was, of course, today probably the biggest sex party in the world today. It's a party that happens twice a year at Laboratory Club, a club that belongs to the Berghain building, or is in the same building than Berghain, and is run by the same people, but it's on most nights really then separate from Berghain. But for the snacks party then, it's then in an extended part of the building, and it's probably the biggest sex party in the world today. And that all started in the beginning of the 90s at this Bunker Club.
Jeff, I would love to also do this tour. It sounds very, very good. Where can we find all your tours? Where's a good way of following you?
So my website is berlinguide.de. I'm very easy, berlinguide.de, and there you find basically all my tours that I offer. Yeah.
Jeff Magnus, thank you so much. I'm full of history things now, and I learned so much from you. I totally enjoyed the tour, and I think there will be even more coming one day. I think you're like doing work in progress and developing even more, and it's so important to listen what you say and to follow you and your history lines, because it's very important for all of us to know that history is not a linear heterosexual things. Like, history is always a thing people like change after and say it in one or another way. So it's important to tell different kind of history and like more complex and all your interesting topics. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
This was Sex in Berlin. Thank you for joining. Write us love letters, inside tips, or simply send us messages. All links in the show notes and via Instagram or directly at info@studio36.berlin. Have a nice day. Kisses from Nike. Thank you so much.